Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming. We're going to learn about different various laws and customs which are relevant to eating milchiks on Shavuos, eating dairy foods on Shavuos. There is a very widespread custom to eat dairy foods. Primary custom is to eat it on the first day of Shavuos. There are some customs that also do it on the second day, and even fewer customs that do it on the first night. But the primary custom is to have on the first day of Shavuos milchiks. It's one of the few customs that, to the best of my knowledge, is very widespread throughout all Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities. And the source of this custom is not even exactly clear exactly how it started, but there are many reasons given for this custom. The very first reasons, or one of the first reasons, is found in a sefer called the Kolboi. This line of the Kolboi is not on the page. The Kolboi he's still considered a Rishon, so from the earlier authorities, but towards the end of that period. And he records the custom to eat on Shavuos dvash v'cholav, honey, sweet things with honey, and the milk. And he also records the custom of having bread or perhaps even matzah left over from Pesach dipped in cinnamon. And he goes through the reasons for these customs, and he says the reasons to eat honey and milk are because Torah is compared to honey and milk, as the pasuk says, "Devash v'cholov tachas l'shoinech," honey and milk under your tongue, referring like an analogy to the sweetness of Torah. So, because the Torah was given on Shavuos, we have honey and milk related to giving of the Torah. There's also many other reasons given to do with the gematria of milk. The gematria of chalav is 40, the 40 days that Moshe was on the mountain. Mincha chadosha laHashem b'shavuos seichem, which are words in the Torah which refer to Shavuos. Spell the Rosh Tevis, the first letters of those words put together would spell the word chalav, which is milk, and so on and so forth. Google it, you'll find umpteen reasons why to have milchiks on Shavuos. Yes?
The dvash that's referred to in the Tanakh, whatever, it's really dates.
Yeah, dvash usually in Israel refers to dates honey, but the point is to have something sweet. To the best of my knowledge, the truth is the Mishnah Berurah does say, if I recall correctly, that one should have honey on Shavuos, but to the best of my knowledge, it is not the prevalent custom to specifically have honey. Having milk and cheese cakes and all those things is a very widespread custom. There's also other reasons to do with the fact, which the Rabbi also discusses at length in various places, about the possibility that the Jews weren't able to eat meat after Matan Torah because they didn't have time to slaughter meat with kosher slaughtering knives, and all the other preparations that go into having meat. Anyway, however, in Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Tov Tzadik Dalet, Erechaim Siman Tov Tzadik Dalet, and this is the first source on the sheet, the Ramah, in his glosses to Shulchan Aruch, brings this custom, and he elaborates more than what he usually does when it comes to customs. The Ramah usually just says what customs are. He doesn't usually elaborate as to the reason for them. So let's read this inside. Number one. The Ramah says, "V'noyagin b'chol mokim." It is customary in all places, le'echol machalei chalav b'yom rishon shel Shavuos, to eat dairy foods on the first day of Shavuos. V'nireli atam, and I think that the reason is, or I will suggest the reason, shehu k'moi hashnei tavshilim shaloikchim b'leila Pesach. This is similar to the two cooked items which we have on the night of Pesach. Zeichel Pesach v'Zeichel Chagiga as a commemoration for the Pesach and a commemoration of the Chagiga. Kein oichle machel chalav, so too we have a dairy food, v'achkach machel bas, and afterwards the meat food. V'tzrichim lahavi imohim beis lechem ala shulchan, and one has to bring two breads on the table, shabumakim mizbeach, which is in place of the mizbeach. V'yashbez as a karna beis al shtei alechem. This, remember, is the two loaves of bread, sheim akrivim bikurim, which were offered in the Beis Hamikdash on Shavuos. So what's going on over here? So the Ramah refers, first of all, to, we need to sort of make a few introductions, and then the Ramah will make sense. First of all, on Pesach, we have two items on the Seder plate. On the Chabad custom, they're on the top of the Seder plate. On the right, you have the roasted bone, and on the left, you have the cooked egg. Why do we have two cooked items on the Seder plate? They are to commemorate the two karbanos, which, in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, every Yid ate on the night of Pesach, the Karban Pesach and the Karban Chagiga. These were two karbanos, two sacrifices that were brought on eaten on the night of Pesach, sacrificed the day before Pesach, and eaten on the night of Pesach. So that's why we have two cooked items. Now, some of you might remember various resemblances or things we say we have an egg because beya in Aramaic and all sorts of things for the egg, but that's why we choose to have an egg for the cooked item. The reason we have the two cooked items is to remember the two karbanos. Now, you could have any cooked item. You could have a cooked piece of fish. Why do you have a cooked egg? So there's other sort of resemblances in the egg, but the primary custom is to have two cooked items. So the Ramah says the same is true on Shavuos. On Shavuos, the specialty, the uniqueness of Shavuos over other Yom Tovim was the special carbon in the Beis HaMikdash, which consisted of two loaves of bread. The uniqueness of them was in part because they were chametz, and karbanos in the Beis HaMikdash were not allowed to be chametz, with the exception of the shtei halechem, the two breads on Shavuos. Now, there is a halacha. So B'meilo, the Ramah says we're looking here to make a remembrance to the two loaves of bread. So we want every person to have two loaves of bread on Shavuos. So how are we going to get everyone to have two loaves of bread on Shavuos? So he says, have a pashta eitzah. Have milchiks and fleishiks. Now the halacha is that you're not allowed to use the same loaf of bread with a milchik meal as you are with a fleishik meal. Back in the day, the mainstay of every meal was bread. There was no such thing as eating a meal without bread, right? So you had your loaf of bread. So even if the loaf of bread is not milchik or fleishik per se, but if you had your dairy meal with cheese and milk, and you had a loaf of bread on the table, that loaf of bread cannot then be used for in your next meal, which is fleishik. You're not allowed to use the same loaf of bread.
Why is
because
that?
Because we're concerned that there may be some sort of remnants of cheese, a crumb of cheese that got onto the bread, or a crumb of meat that got onto the bread, or some gravy and stuff like that. Practically speaking, in many situations, there are heterim, especially if it's like sliced bread in a packet. You don't say that every slice of bread in the packet thing, but definitely when this is most practical, I would think, is if people want to have after Shabbos, people wash for Malav Malka. We have a special meal after Shabbos, and often people want to have a milchik meal after Shabbos. And you say, oh well, I have the leftover challah from the Shabbos meal, and I'll use that for Malav Malka. So that's forbidden because the bread that was on the table with your fleishik kacholent cannot be eaten with your milchik meal. And if you look in the papers on number 6. This is a quote from Shulchan Aruch in Simon Peites, the laws of milk and meat. Misha achal gvina v'roitzel echal basa, somebody who ate cheese and wants to afterwards eat meat. Tzarich levar mi al hashulchan sheyurei pas she'achleim hagvina, has to remove from the table any leftover breads that was eaten together with the meat. V'aso lechel gvina al mappa she'achal b'basar v'chein lehepechasar. It's also forbidden to use the same tablecloth, which we'll come to later if we have time to discuss. If you have milchiks and fleishiks on Shavuos, the separation that has to be made in the middle. I hope to have time to get to it. So one of the most basic things that you have to do is change the tablecloth. Now, so you're not allowed to have the same bread. So there are basically what the Ramah says is like this: we want you to have, the custom is to have two different loaves of bread in order to remember the shtei halechem. How do you have two loaves of bread? You have milchiks and you have fleishiks. If you have milchiks and fleishiks, then automatically you're going to have two loaves of bread, and hence you have your commemoration for the shtei halechem.
Aren't we making motzi though on two loaves of bread?
So, presumably the Ramah's understanding is that we want to have two distinct loaves of bread. And if you look in, I hope I quoted it here. Yes, in source 2, Look in source 2, sorry?
If you have 3 loaves,
Yeah.
2 for them might see, and then we'll have 1 on the side for whatever else you need.
Look in source 2. In 2 is split into 3. I've quoted here the Magen Avraham, Sivkoton Vav, Sivkoton Ches, and Sivkoton Tes, which the Magen Avraham goes in Sivkotons, which are sort of notes. So if you look at number Ches, which is bolded in the middle of the paragraph, Utrichim Lahavi, so he's quoting the Ramah saying that you have to bring a second loaf of bread. The also lechel basar v'chalav melechem echad. So the Magen Avraham explains that the reason is because it's forbidden to have meat and milk with the same loaf of bread. Therefore, the custom is, says the Magen Avraham, to bake the bread with butter. The custom has become, says the Magen Avraham, and to the best of my knowledge, this is not necessarily the custom today, to knead the dough with butter, because then the bread has not just been on the table with milk, the bread is actually milk, and therefore nobody will even by mistake come to leave the same bread on the table. They will be forced to bring another loaf of bread for the meat meal, and then we'll certainly have fulfilled the custom of having 2 loaves of bread. And also that way, Jonathan, if you knead the bread with butter, then you've had clearly 2 distinct loaves of bread. Now,
but today it's par, so it's simpler.
What's par?
All the breads.
Right, but even though the bread is parav, if you had it on the table with your dairy meal, you're not allowed to have it on the table with your meat meal. So you have to have
So if you do 2 breads and you eat one, you put the other aside. You can't use that later.
No, that's okay. If you just had it on the table and made the bracha, as long as it wasn't on the table while you're eating the milk, that's okay.
You put it aside.
Yeah, 100%. Now, okay. Now before we move on to other reasons and the halachic nafkaminas, the differences, the practical ramifications of the different reasons, let's discuss this reason a bit. First of all, read the next line in the Magen Avraham. That's the first difference. Because the minhag is to have the milk and meat, to have 2 loaves of bread, to remember the shtei halechem. What were the shtei halechem in the Beis HaMikdash made out of? They're made out of wheat. And so the 2 breads that you have, the one with your dairy meal and the one with your meat meal, have to be made out of wheat. So this would mean that if we're going with the Ramah's reason in Shulchan Aruch, anybody who's on a wheat-free diet and he's only having spelt or oats or whatever it is, he cannot fulfill the custom of having milchiks on Shavuos, because the whole point of the custom is to make sure you have 2 distinct loaves of bread, both made out of wheat. If you're not eating wheat, then you haven't fulfilled any custom over here. Additionally, so first of all, that has to be wheat. Secondly, l'chayra, according to the Ramah, you would have to have bread by both meals, right? So if you just make kiddush and let's say you make kiddush on Shavuos after shul and you have cheese blintzes. Cheese blintzes we discussed yesterday, Jonathan. Cheese blintzes on mazonos, and there's an obligation. In order to fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush, you have to have a meal in close proximity to the Kiddush. Now, close proximity means both in place and in time. So you have to have, in the place that you made Kiddush, you have to have a meal, and it has to be right away. You can't wait. So what constitutes a meal? So basically, anything that's mazonos constitutes a meal. Anything that we make the bracha on it mazonos constitutes a meal. So if you have cheese blintzes, if you make kiddush and have cheese blintzes, you have fulfilled your obligation of kiddush. You've made kiddush and you've had a meal of mazonos. However, you haven't fulfilled the minhag of having milchiks on Shavuos according to the Ramah, because the Ramah says the point is to have bread. You haven't had bread. Blintzes is not bread.
Maybe we mechan the milchiks, not the
But according to the Ramah, there is no custom to have milchiks. The custom is to have milchiks with bread.
Mamish with bread, not having
Well,
So according to the Ramah, do you need a bench after your dairy meal? And
we'll get there soon about benching. But the point is to have 2 distinct loaves of bread, right? According to the Ramah, there is no custom to have dairy on Shavuos. The custom is to have dairy with bread.
no cheese.
Why would you say that?
That is what the Magen
It says
Avraham.
that the minhag is the Magen Avraham. You're saying?
Look at the Ramah says the words "Tzrichin lahavi imayim shtei lechem al hashulchan," and therefore v'yesh b'zeh l'karin shtei lechem. And if you look at the Magen Avraham, it's explicit that that's how he understands the Ramah. Look in Zivkot Neches. Tzrichim lahavi the asur lechol basar v'chalav. If you look at all the Achronim, it's unanimous. All the Achronim understand the Ramah to be saying that the point of there's no custom to have milchiks. The custom is to have milchiks with bread and fleishiks with bread, and then you've had 2 loaves of bread. According to the Ramah, there's no value in having cheese blintzes on Shavuos.
So you really have 2 meals.
Maybe his
Yeah.
wife's
Well-
he lived when bread was a ikr, but now
Good, so, but he's-
Zionist is there.
But but if you're having mezonos, then you haven't fulfilled the minhag of having shtei alechem. Let me clarify something. The Ramos now there is a concept of pas haba b'kisnin, sometimes referred to in America as mezonos bread. What does that mean? Bread in the lechem, in the usual what we say, has a special bracha. Hamoitzi lechem min haaretz. We thank Hashem for bringing bread out of the ground. Bread. What's the ingredients of bread? The main ingredients of bread are flour and water. What happens if you have bread that is made out of other ingredients? For example, if you have a bread that has sugar and chocolate in it. In English, we don't call that bread, we call it chocolate cake. So then, that is, amongst other things, called pas haba b'kisnin, pocket bread in halacha. The pas haba b'kisnin includes various different types of things. It includes danishes, if they're sweet enough, and many other things are called pas haba b'kisnin. So they have a halachic status of quasi bread. So we don't make on them the bracha hamoitzi. We make on them the bracha mezonos. We don't say hamoitzi lechem in aretz. We say berimini mezonos, which is a sort of lower degree bracha. However, if one makes them into a meal, so then that's still considered bread. Then you make hamoitzi on them. So if somebody were to have a meal out of chocolate cake, so then, and not the topic for today's share of how much you have to eat in order for it to be considered a meal, but whatever that amount is, if somebody has a meal of chocolate cake, then you wash, you make a bracha on the tilas yadayim, and you say hamoitzi lechem min haaretz, and you eat your chocolate cake, right? But not everything that's mezonos constitutes as pas haba b'kisnin. For example, in order for it to be pas haba b'kisnin, meaning in order for it to qualify as even the lower level of bread, it has to be baked. Which is why before I used the example of cheese blintzes, which are fried. Or donuts. You can have milchik donuts, yeah, they're fried. So you could have donuts from today till tomorrow, it's never going to become bread. Because it's cooked. Or pasta. Pasta is cooked, yeah, you can have all the pasta you want. It's not going to, yeah, you have spaghetti and cheese. And it's still going to be mezonos, and it's good enough to have your mitzvah of kiddush b'makim suda as the meal in the place of kiddush, so you do fine with that, but it's not considered bread. Now, here, so the Ramah says you have to have bread. The Ramah says in order to do the minhag of milchiks, you have to have bread. However, it's implicit from the Magen Avraham that if you have bread that's quote mezonos bread, that's pas haba b'kisnin, it's good enough, because he says the custom is to knead the dough with butter. What happens when you knead the dough with butter instead of with water?
It doesn't say knead, it says to bake.
Okay, but the Pasuk, look in 3 in the Machzah Shekel, right? It's clear that he says in the last line, he says, Al kaponim lo yivarech alechem zeh hamoitzi, yeah? So,
I got it. I'm going to go to the end lashon.
right? 1 second. Right? So the bread that you need with butter instead of water is not hamoitzi bread, it's pas haba b'kisnin, and therefore unless you're having it as the mainstay, as your proper kaveh suda, so then it's not hamoitzi. So the Magen Avraham, in explaining the minhag according to the Ramah, says that the minhag is to make sure to have 2 loaves of bread. But he talks about kneading it with butter. So it's clear from the Magen Avraham that having pas haba b'kisnin, this sort of quasi bread status, is good enough according to the Ramah. So if you want to fulfill the minhag according to the Ramah, you have to you make kiddush, and then you have milchik and bread. So you could either have a piece of cheese, and have challah, which is made out of wheat. It must be made out of wheat, or matzah, anything that's made out of wheat, or it could be pasaba b'kisnin. So it could be a cheese Danish, would be pasaba b'kisnin, or any mazoinus that is in the category of baked of pasaba b'kisnin. But it's not good enough if you're not washing on other challah, it's not good enough to just have your milchik foods by having cheese blintzes and stuff like that, because that's not bread. So far, just to summarize where we're at so far, the Ramah says that the reason to have milchiks on Shavuos is as an excuse to make you have 2 loaves of bread, and therefore, according to the Ramah, in order to fulfill the custom, first of all, you have to have bread. It's not good enough to have just mazoinus, that's not bread. And secondly, it has to be wheat. If you're having spelt or any other wheat-free ingredients, even though they're perfectly fine for the bracha hametzilachem in haaretz, so for the bracha mazoinus, they are not any remembrance to the shtei halechem. They don't, which were made specifically out of wheat, and therefore there's no point in that. Thirdly, this is the third difference that's very important to emphasize according to the Ramah, and that is, what about somebody who's not eating fleishiks, who's not eating meat today? Now, again, time permitting, we'll discuss the various minhagim and halachas about eating meat on any Yom Tov in general. But if, for whatever reason, a person doesn't eat meat on Shavuos, right? Let's say a person doesn't like meat, vegetarian, whatever it is. So then, fair enough. But then there's no point, according to the Ramah, to eat milchiks, because again, the whole point of eating milchiks is because you have milchiks and you have fleishiks. Because you have milchik and fleishik, therefore you have 2 loaves of bread. You have 2 loaves of wheat bread, then it remembers the shtei halechem. But if for whatever reason you're not having meat, so then you might as well just have smoked salmon, because there's no value, according to the Ramah, in having milchiks if you're not having fleishiks.
So if you have those,
So those are the 3. Just 1 second. Those are the 3 points to remember, that the way the Ramah views the custom of having milchiks on Shavuos, you have to have bread, or at least pasaba b'kisnin. You have to have it from wheat, and you have to be having milchiks and fleishiks. Yes.
okay, first of all, how much time between eating the milchik and fleishiks do you have to wait?
Okay.
Secondly, when you consider it the same day, let's say you have the milchiks around noon, how much longer can you wait till it's considered the same day? The afternoon before the evening, right?
Okay, so
you have to have the fleishik, right?
All right. So with regard to your first question, I hope to get to it later. With regards to the second question, yes, any time before evening is considered as the first day. The minhag is to have these 2 breads and 2 meals on the first day, which is any time after davening until shkia, until sunset.
Because where I used to go, they would wait an hour and a half after milchiks and already start eating fleishiks.
That's fine. It's still the same day.
I know, but isn't it enough time between eating milchik and fleishik?
Okay, so that's I hope to get to that still
Okay,
today.
okay.
And b'li neder, if I don't get to it in today's shir, then we'll use some of the time between Mincha and Ma'ariv this week to discuss the time you have to wait and the different things you have to do
Okay.
in between a milchik and a fleishik meal.
Yeah.
Yes.
A question here. We keep talking about it's a minhag to do this. How mechuyev are you in this minhag?
So, I mean, different minhagim, you've asked this question in the past, different minhagim are mechayev and not mechayev. I haven't seen, even, on the one hand, this is a very widespread minhag. On the other hand, from my experience, when I've seen people who have difficulty with this minhag, I've never, it's a minhag, it's a good minhag to do. If for whatever reason it poses difficulty, I don't think I haven't seen that Rabbanim are machmir about this. If a person has, for example, stomach sensitivity to dairy products, so that's okay. You don't do meat. Yeah, you're not obligated to discomfort yourself to do it. Yes.
No, so I have to admit I was ignorant about the ingredients for a cheese blintz, so I Googled it,
Right.
and it says that it includes all-purpose flour.
Right, but the problem with that's a good question. The problem with the cheese blintz is that it's not baked; it's fried. and if it's fried, then it's not bread.
Well, there are recipes where you can bake.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, I stand corrected.
All-purpose flour.
When my mother makes
All-purpose
Your
flour.
mom fries
when
them.
my mother makes cheese blintzes,
My mom bakes them.
she
So,
fries them.
okay, so if you bake them, then
Right.
it's allowed?
Yeah, then that would be good enough. We're gonna see later. Hopefully, there's other. I'm talking now only in the opinion of the Ramah. I hope to get beyond that. But one example, which would be l'chol hadeis, wouldn't be good enough according to the Ramah, is macaroni and cheese. Any types of pasta, which also the ingredients of pasta, as far as I know, it's basically flour and water. But they are cooked. They're not baked. Even I don't think anybody just bakes pasta. Lasagna is a discussion. If it's personally, there are some rabbanim who say that lasagna is considered baked, which would also mean that lasagna is hamotzi. Personally, I don't think lasagna is considered baked because I don't think the pasta in the lasagna sticks, whatever they're called, I don't think they become cooked from the heat of the oven as much as they become cooked from the heat of the tomato juice and cheese surrounding it. It's sort of a second stage thing, which is the definition of cook. But again, a discussion for another time. But if you make mezainis on lasagna, which I assume most of you do, then that means you're following the opinion that lasagna is cooked, and also would not suffice according to the Ramah's opinion. I just want to point out another thing which is debatable, but the original minhag in the Kolboy, for example, speaks about having milk on Shavuos. The Ramah talks about having dairy products, ma'acholei cholav. Now, it could be that according to the Ramah, a cup of milk wouldn't do anything because a cup of milk is not part of, like, you don't eat your cup of milk with bread, which would make you then require a second loaf for the meat meal. So if the reason is because the Torah is compared to milk, so then a cup of milk is good enough, right? So there are people who don't like to eat cheese or whatever, but they want just a cup of milk. So according to the Ramah, that's not good enough, but according to the other reasons, that would be fine. Now, parenthetically, I should add in something which is quite important. The Magen Avraham mentioned that the custom was to knead the dough, to make the bread with butter. Instead of water, they made butter. Now, there's a big problem with this. If you look in your source sheets on number 4, which is also from Shulchan Aruch, the laws of milk and meat, Ein loshin isur b'cholav. You're not allowed to knead a dough with milk. Shema yavei la'achla im basar, because you may come to eat it with meat. V'im losh, if you did do so, kol hapas asur, the whole bread is forbidden, afila la'achla levado, even to eat it alone. There is a gezerah of Chazal, there is a halacha that you're not allowed to make milchik bread. Period. What happens if you made milchik bread? There's a knas, there's a punishment. If a person violated this law and made milchik bread, he has to throw the whole thing in the bin, in the garbage. You're not even allowed to eat it. You're not even allowed to eat it. You're not allowed to do anything. You must dispose of this bread.
Can't sell it to the non-Jews?
Listen, ask your local competent Orthodox knowledgeable rabbi.
That means you can.
So, right? But you're definitely not allowed to, it's not asa bahana, but you're not allowed to eat it. You're not even allowed to eat it by itself or with cheese. You can't say, I'm going to eat it now. Okay, let me just eat it plain, without meat, without cheese, without anything. No, you've made milchik bread. It is absolutely forbidden to eat. So, how can the Ramah say that the custom is to make bread with butter? You're not allowed to make bread with butter. So the answer is that there are two exceptions to the rule. There's two ways that you are allowed to make milchik bread. One is if you make a davar mu'at, if you're only making a small amount. Because what's the reason why you're not allowed to make milchik bread? Because we're scared that you're going to have a loaf of bread here. You'll forget that this bread has milk in it, and you'll accidentally come and eat it with meat. But if you make a small amount, so you're going to eat it right away, and you're going to eat it right away. If you eat it right away, you're not going to forget. We're only scared if you leave it for a long time, then you might forget. So if you're making a lot of loaves of bread that could last you a while, so then you have to throw them all out. But if you're making a very small amount, then it's okay, and you're allowed to eat it. You're allowed to eat it. What constitutes a small amount? So it's machlokes mechaber Ramah, but for Ashkenazim, which I believe everyone around this table are Ashkenazim, is that correct? So for Ashkenazim, we follow the lenient opinion of the Ramah, and that is the amount that you eat in one day. So if you're making bread for you and your household, doesn't mean one person, however many people are in your household are going to finish within that day, that's considered a small amount, and one day is considered a small amount of time that you're going to finish it within one day, and that's good enough. The second way that it's, but that doesn't allow you to cook a lot. The second way is if you make a special simon in the bread. If you bake the bread in a different shape or something like that, that tells you that it's milchik. Now,
It's like in Israel with the triangle.
right,
and the circles.
and I was just going to say, if you go to Israel, any of the bakeries with a good hechsher in Israel, all the burekas, potato, spinach, mushroom, whatever burekas they have, are all rectangles or squares or perhaps even round, but all of the cheese burekas are triangles. Because a cheese bureka, a bureka, like we said before, is a type of bread, and even though it may be mazonis if you're having a small amount of it, but it is a bread, and it's forbidden to make a milchik bread unless you make a small amount, which the bakeries are obviously not doing, or if you make a special shape. So if you make a special shape, everyone in Israel knows if you have a triangle bureka, it is milchik, and nobody will accidentally come to have a triangle bureka with their cold cuts. Now, so when the Magen Avraham says that it is to the custom to knead the dough with butter, so you have to make sure to knead your dough with butter in one of two ways: either to only make a very small amount, which for Ashkenazim means no more than you're going to eat on the first day of Shavuos, or alternatively to make the dough with butter in a special shape. However, if you look in the original customs, you'll see that one of the customs was to make bread in a funny shape on Shavuos. And if you look in your sources, in number 5, the Kolboy, the line before this in the Kolboy talks about the minhag of having milk and honey on Shavuos. He says, "Gam nohagu anoshim lasis b'Shavuos lechem aruch." It's also the custom of the women to make in Shavuos a very long bread. V'loy arba aroshim, with 4 heads. They make a special bread with, instead of a usual loaf has 2 ends, so they would somehow make a loaf with 4 ends. The reason why they made this double-looking bread is because, first of all, it would serve as a remembrance for the shtei halechem, the 2 loaves that were brought on Shavuos again. Alternatively, an interesting reason. There's the certain, what's the word, celestial? Constellation of the stars and the planets, and the constellation of the stars, there's 12 shapes that they represent, and the month of Sivan, the constellation of the stars represents the shape of to'imim, of twins. So to sort of in the remembrance of this double, they made the 4 thing. So if you put all of this together, it comes out very neat. That the Magen Avraham says that the custom was to knead the dough with butter. If you knead dough with butter, you have to make sure it's a special shape. But we're okay, because anyway, on Shavuos, the custom was to knead the dough with 4 heads. So, with 4 ends, so that was okay.
Where did the Kolboy live? Is he European?
The Kolboy was Ashkenazi, yeah. I think, but could be in France, I'm not sure, but he was definitely Ashkenazi. Okay. Now. Let's look in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, which is source number 7. Shimon Tov Tzadik Daled, again the laws of Shavuos, Sif Tazayin. Noyagin b'chol ha'mekoymos, it is the custom in many places, in all places, le'echol ma'choli cholav b'yom Shavuos, to eat milchiks on the first day of Shavuos. O minhag aviseinu Torah, it is the minhag of aviseinu, and our ancestors' minhag is considered Torah. It is special. It is part of Torah. And therefore, we shouldn't be, if somebody has difficulty to have milchiks and fleishiks, so then you could be makel. But it's just because you're lazy, that's not a good excuse. It is a special minhag to have milchiks on Shavuos. Ki harbe tamim nemru, all of there are many reasons, says the Alter Rebbe, given for this minhag. Then the Alter Rebbe adds, because there is a mitzvah to eat meat on every Yom Tov, as will be explained in the laws of Yom Tov, chapter 529. Therefore, one has to be careful not to transgress any of the laws of basar b'cholav, of mixing meat and milk. And you should conduct yourself in the manner prescribed in Yeridei, chapter 88 and 89, which discuss the laws of mixing meat and milk. So, in other words, the custom is to eat milk for many reasons, but you also have to eat meat because it's Yom Tov, and therefore be careful not to mix meat and milk and to wait the requisite time and change the tablecloth and all the things which we'll yet discuss that have to be done between milk and meat. Now, first of all, what's Alter Rebbe referring to when he talks about the chiyuv to eat the eating meat on Yom Tov? So that's the next source. 8 we won't read the whole paragraph. If you just go to the middle of the paragraph, so the Alter Rebbe said, let's read the whole thing. Okay, this is the laws of Yom Tov. Now on Yom Tov, on Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, the mitzvah in the Torah is to rejoice, to be happy. So how do we fulfill the mitzvah of being happy? So, Kates and Mesamchon, how do you make your family happy? Haktanim, this is obviously coming in the middle of a long thing, so Haktanim, the children, you give them roasted and grain and nuts, basically you give them nash. Hanoshim, the women, you buy them new clothes and jewelry according to your means. I remember in Rabbi Hilchos was our Shkoil in Kanai, he used to say the Yungalite are all, no offense, the Yungalite before Sukkot are all busy trying to find the best esrog, and this guy spends $150 on esrog and $300 on esrog. He says there's no obligation to buy an esrog. You could use your friend's esrog, you could do whatever you want, but there is an obligation to buy your wife a nice present for Yom Tov. So
like this. People are trying to get into my business on the whole side.
The women paid him off for that one.
Now, so that's right.
Even the Rabbanim are trying to get
So okay, so men, children have the mitzvah of simcha by giving them nash. Women, you buy them gifts for Yom Tov. How do men fulfill the obligation of simcha? So early on in the simcha, by the way, I'm just going to point out parenthetically, by the way, the Alter Rebbe says earlier that on Yom Tov, at least for men, there is an obligation to have wine on every day of Yom Tov at least, and this is early on, not in this Sif, and also on Chol Hamoed. So on all 8 days of Pesach, on all 9 days of Sukkot, and on the 2 days of Shavuos, there's an obligation for all men to have a cup of wine. Wine as opposed to grape juice, l'chayra, because otherwise it's not Mesameach. Okay, but then back to the point at hand.
By the way, the women didn't eat the shlomim?
They weren't mechuyev. Men, so how do men fulfill the obligation of simcha? In the time that the Beis HaMikdash was standing, they would eat the meat of the karbonis, of the sacrifices for simcha. Nowadays that the Beis HaMikdash, we no longer have a Beis HaMikdash. Nowadays you fulfill the mitzvah of simcha through wine. Nowadays we don't have the karbonis, we don't have the sacrificial meats, so there's no simcha through the sacrificial meats, so you mekayim the simcha through wine, which is what I just said before, that you have to have wine in Yom Tov, and early on in the Siyam, the Alter Rebbe says that it applies to Chol Hamoed also. Aval, basar, eating meat, ein choiva, there is no obligation to eat meat on Yom Tov, to eat it nowadays, because we don't have the sacrificial meats. Nevertheless, even though there's no obligation to eat meat, mitzvah yesh b'achilas basar b'Yom Tov, there is a mitzvah to eat meat on Yom Tov, because the Torah refers to eating meat with the lashon of simcha. Since we cannot rejoice with eating meat in the original form of the simcha of eating meat, namely eating the sacrificial meats, we should do it with other simchas, which includes eating meat and other things, and then the Alter Rebbe continues. Therefore, the custom is to have therefore we have extra foods on Yom Tov more than we do on Shabbos, and extra foods on and special nice clothes. Okay, so in short, nowadays there is no obligation to eat meat on Yom Tov. However, there is a mitzvah to eat meat on Yom Tov. So you're not strictly speaking, obligated to do so, but it's highly recommended. I should point out, by the way, that this is not that this mitzvah of eating meat is not fulfilled by eating b'sar oif, so chicken, turkey, or any bird meat. This is specifically by behema meat, like beef, sheep, duck, lamb, not duck, buffalo, giraffe. No. Any type of giraffe would be a
Buffalo is a
chayim.
kind of fish too.
Sorry.
If you be careful when you say
Yeah.
buffalo, it's kind of fish.
Yeah, it's like when you say Muncie, Virginia. But
Yeah, it looks like
but anyway, a buffalo might be is buffalo a behema or a chaya?
Buffalo?
I don't know if the mitzvah of simcha goes through b'sar chaya. Either way, the mitzvah is, if you want to do the mitzvah is to do meat on Yom Tov as opposed to
red meat.
bird meat. Okay, so that's what the Alter Rebbe is referring to in Hilchos
I
Shavuos.
think buffalo is bovine. I think it has.
No, you eat bison burgers.
I think it's a cat. It's a cattle.
Cattle, yeah, bison burgers.
Anyway, so the mitzvah is to meat. Now, so let's recap the Alter Rebbe again, the one in Hilchos Shavuos. It says the minhag is many places to eat machal, to eat dairy products on Shavuos. Minhag avaseinu b'yodeinu because there's many reasons for it, but because you also have to have meat on Yom Tov, because there's a mitzvah to have meat on Yom Tov, make sure to make the requisite partition and breaks and etc. between meat and milk. No. What do we see from this Alter Rebbe?
You don't have to eat meat.
The Alter Rebbe is not going, or at least not only going, with the reason of the Ramah. Because if you're going with the reason of the Ramah, don't tell me you need to eat meat because you're supposed to eat meat on Yom Tov. You need to eat meat because the custom is to have milk and meat. So when the Alter Rebbe tells us that you have to have meat because of Yom Tov, so implicit in that Alter Rebbe is that you don't need to do the minhag the way the Ramah. I mean, Harbi Tamim could include the reason of the Ramah. The Alter Rebbe is not saying that the reason of the Ramah is not valid,
Dik is the milk.
but the minhag is to have milk. You also have to have meat because it's Yom Tov, so make sure the thing. But according to the Ramah, there's no minhag to have milk. The minhag is to have milk and to have meat. So don't tell me you need to have meat because it's Yom Tov, right? So, all of those three things that we said before, according to the Alter Rebbe, they're not necessary. So even if somebody is on a wheat-free diet, he can still fulfill the custom because he could have dairy without having wheat. Even if somebody doesn't want to have bread, he only wants to have pasta, then he can still fulfill the custom because you don't need to have bread. And even if somebody is a vegetarian, he could also fulfill the minhag by having milk. According to the Ramah, if you have milk without meat, you haven't fulfilled the custom. According to the Alter Rebbe, if you have milk without meat, so you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah of having meat on Yom Tov, but that's a separate story. As far as the custom of having milk on Shavuos is concerned, you're good to go.
Aren't you supposed to wash on Yom Tov?
Yes, you are supposed to wash.
In other words, to be fulfilling a mitzvah, to fulfill eating a su'udah, you should really have washed.
Yeah, you do have to wash on Yom Tov, and there's actually in the Rebbe's Haggadah there's a tzarichion. The question is the obligation to wash and have bread on Yom Tov, is it a biblical or a rabbinical obligation? But either way, it is definitely an obligation to have bread on Yom Tov. Yeah.
So in other words, you have to. Just eating milk is not good enough.
Well, you could.
Suda. You could be yotze milchiks and then you could have bread later.
Right. Exactly. Now, lamaisa, yes. So how do you make kiddush? Now you have to wash on Yom Tov. So you could either wash and have your milchiks, and then have fleishiks later. And we'll talk again if we have time, or during the week, about what you have to do between. But right, or you could just make kiddush and have your cheese blintzes and ice cream, and then go home and wash and have a fleishik meal. Now, you could wash for both. You could wash as many times as you want, but the bare minimum is to wash once during the day on Yom Tov. There is some discussion as to perhaps if you're only going to wash once, then perhaps it's better to wash for the meat fleishik over the milchiks. There's a Madana Yom Tov which has such a kind of mashmos that it's better to wash to fulfill the obligation of having meat on Yom Tov together with bread. There is such a concept, but again, not strictly speaking, and if you prefer to wash For the milchik meal, that's fine. Many people do it that way, and that's fine. Yes.
So what the Alter Rebbe is saying, this makes a distinction between Chabad and other Ashkenazi?
No.
And Sephardim?
No, not at all. Because, to the best of my knowledge, the Ramah is not. The Ramah is unique in this. In other words, I don't think.
So the Ramah is making the distinction.
Let me. How do you say this? I'm pointing this out from the Alter Rebbe. You could possibly point out the same thing from other poskim as well. And to the best of my knowledge, the prevalent custom is not to wash twice during the day, or to have two separate meals of bread on Shavuos day. And to the best of my knowledge, even people who don't eat wheat do fulfill this minhag. So it could be that it's better to do it the way the Ramah says. In other words, it's better to have wheat, and it's better to have to have two types of bread, at least pasaba b'kisnin bread, and that's true even if you're following the Alter Rebbe, because the Alter Rebbe doesn't negate the reason of the Ramah. It's just from the way he words the halacha, we see that he is not limited to the reason of the Ramah. Right?
So in practice, by another Chabad place, we usually just said mazonos, and then we would only say the motzi on the fleishik meal.
That's fine. That's fine, and even according to the Ramah, that's fine, because chances are, I don't know which place, but most places, at least some of the mazonos things that you have would constitute bread, if not regular bread, at least the quasi status of bread of pasaba b'kisnin. So if you have crackers or cake, or even most cheesecake is a bit, depends exactly how it's made, but many cakes and mazonos that we have constitute bread. There's only, at least pasaba b'kisnin, there's only certain items, such as things which are only cooked, that do not constitute bread at all.
So what's going to happen here on Shavuos? We're going to have a milchik kiddush.
Milchik kiddush, to the best of my knowledge, does not.
With no washing.
To the best of my knowledge, there's no washing here.
No washing. Just mazonos.
I believe so.
I would point out that at the milchik kiddush with the mazonos, you have to be very careful how much you eat, because you may get into the question of a suffix of being
Kaveh Suda.
and so you should
Saveh.
just have a little bit of mazonos.
That's true.
Like a little bit
It
of
also
mazonos.
depends what your plan is, because if you're planning to go home and have a fleishik meal right away, then hopefully you won't be overcome by temptation and you won't eat so much. But that's definitely a valid point to be aware of, that once you have a certain amount, which basically is one of the considerations is if you're saveya, if you're not hungry anymore, then it's certainly a concern, and especially here, if you haven't eaten at all that day, or even if you haven't eaten since the morning, and now it's 11:30, 12 o'clock, and you're hungry and you're eating, you're very likely to think, and therefore either watch how much you eat, or don't eat, or just have the things that are clearly like ice cream or whatever it is, or wash. I'm sure there's bread here if you want to wash. Yes.
So there's consideration if you're hungry,
Sorry?
Not hungry.
Okay, Miyat Hashem will discuss the halachas on mazonos bread another time, but just important to bear in mind not to eat too much. It's unfortunately we can't discuss everything in one thing. Now, what time is it? Okay, we have still another few minutes. So I think what we should do in the next few minutes is to address the topic of what to do in between milchiks and fleishiks. Now, strictly speaking, halachically, the bare minimum of what has to be done in between milchiks and fleishiks is, let's look in source number 13. Is it still going there? Source number 13 on the other side of the page. This is from Shulchan Aruch. Ochel gevina, if somebody ate cheese, mutar lechel achrav basar miyad, it's permissible for him to eat meat straight away, immediately afterwards. Ovolvad sheyayin yadav shelo yishum davar ma'agvina, you have to check your hands to make sure there's no cheese left on your hands. And if it was at night, with lack of lights the way we have, at night the assumption is that you're not able to check your hands so well and to see clearly that there isn't even a tiny drop of cheese left. So then you have to wash your hands. You have to, well, it's two forms of cleansing out your mouth, which the Mechaber then goes on to explain, basically means you have to eat something and drink something. So, the bare minimum that you have to have in between milchiks and fleishiks is, number one, make sure your hands are completely clean. Number two, eat and drink something in whichever order, even though the Mechaber says you have to eat and then drink, but the Poskim say it could be in the other order also. You could drink something and then eat something, that's okay. But eat and drink something to make sure your mouth is clean of any pieces of cheese. And fourth of all, what we mentioned earlier, to change the tablecloth. So those are the bare minimum. You have to change the tablecloth, make sure your hands are clean, and eat and clean out your mouth.
Okay.
However,
What about a distinction between yellow cheese and no, okay.
one thing at a time.
Okay.
Right? Now, however,
Put some chemical tummy.
yeah, so there's certain things which are not good enough to rinse out your mouth. Okay. However, the however is like this. There is, Al Pi Kabbalah, the Zohar speaks very strongly about making proper separation between milk and meat, and between both directions, between meat and milk, and between milk and meat. And if you're looking, what's unique about this Zohar is that, unlike many things which are of Kabbalistic nature remain so Kabbalistic nature, this particular concept from the Zohar is brought and underscored and emphasized by virtually all of the poskim, all of the halachic authorities. When it comes over here, they all quote the Zohar, and we're not going to go through all of them. But if you look in source number 14, which is the Beis Yosef, who is the Mechaber of Shulchan Aruch, he quotes the Zohar. V'yesh machmirin and atzmon, some are stringent upon themselves not to eat meat after cheese, besuda achas in one meal. Because it is written in the Zohar in Parshas Mishpatim. Ashkechon, we find the kol man da'achal ha'michlo kechada, anybody who eats these foods, namely meat and milk, together, a b'shayt chada in 1 hour, a b'sudas chada in 1 meal, arboin yomin is chazia gadya mekalsa bekalpoi, for 40 days there's, I don't know exactly what this means, but some goat dancing sort of to his corresponding mazel, basically not a good thing. And the help of the impurity becomes close to him. And it causes it causes the arousal of dinin, of severity in the world. Dinin de Kadishin, which are not holy, and if he will have a child in those 40 days, that child will have a neshama from the side of impurity, which is not holy. So, yeah. So, without getting into all the intricacies of exactly what the Zohar means, it's clear that he's being very strict about making the requisite separation between milk and meat, and between meat and milk. Now, the poskim, who all bring the Zohar and all say that it is appropriate to be machmir, differ somewhat in the extent to which one has to make a differentiation, a separation between milk and meat. One thing which is clear is that according to the Zohar, and this is the custom of Chabad, and the custom of, as far to the best of my knowledge, the custom of virtually all Hasidim and many others, and that is not to have them in the same meal, to make a bracha achrona or to bench or whatever it is between milk and meat. Now, if you've had meat, then it is an obligation to bench before you've had milk. So even if you've had meat and then you're eating other things and you had your meal go on for 6 hours, you can't say, oh, well, it's been 6 hours since I had a piece of meat, I can have milk now. You have to, halachically, you have to bench, and then you can have the cheese. And there's this discussion as to whether or not it's okay to bench in order to have the cheese, or you have to have actually finished your meal. whatever the case is. When it comes to having, if you've had your milk or your cheese and after that you want to have meat, so then, like we said before, halachically there's only those 4 things you have to do: change the tablecloth, wash your hands, and eat and drink something. However, based on this Zohar, the Pasuk can say that one also has to make a bracha achroina, one also has to bench. And just for illustration, if you look back in source number 11, because for this is the Prima Godim, the bottom of the first side of the page. Because for the authority is right that even the same is true for somebody who is careful not to eat meat after cheese mitam hazoya, based on the Zohar Havia Lavush, Berechaim Kufay Gimel, quoted by the Lavush, Shehiflig Ma'od B'choyme Zeh, who is very elaborate in the severity of this idea. Nami tzarich levarich bracha achreina achar hachalav, also has to make a bracha achreina, a benching, a ber nefashos ala michya, whatever the case is, and after blessing to conclude your milchik meal before you have the meat. Over Shavuos, says the Prima Godim, on Shavuos ne'egin lechel machali chalav, on Shavuos the custom is to have dairy foods, u'mevarchim birchas hamazon, and you bench, and then you have meat. And this is clear in other poskim also, and this is definitely the custom that should be adopted, if at all possible, not to have milchiks and fleishiks in the same meal, but to bench in between. So now we're up to changing the tablecloth, obviously not using the same loaf of bread, washing your hands or checking your hands, eat, drink something, and make a bracha achreina. What about the amount of time to wait in between? So this again is subject to dispute amongst the poskim as to exactly what the Zohar means. And the reason for the confusion is because the Zohar says not to eat these foods together, or in 1 hour, or in one meal. So there's different ways of understanding exactly what this means.
Couldn't eat them together. That would be
Yeah, obviously together, but the way many understand it, and the Pri Torah explains it this way, is that he's saying in general, don't eat these things together. Now, how much of a separation do you need to make? So it depends. If you're having first milk and then meat, then b'shai techada, don't have it in 1 hour. If you're having meat and then milk, then don't have it in one meal, which the differentiation between one meal and another meal is discussed in halacha as being 6 hours. So therefore wait 6 hours between meat and milk, and wait 1 hour between milk and meat. That's the way many understand it, and that is also the Chabad custom, to wait an hour between milchiks and fleishiks. So again, you're benching, washing your hands, eat, drink something, change the tablecloth, and wait an hour.
You also get the most lenient opinion for waiting between meals. It's 1 hour, right?
No, 6 hours.
Between cheese into meat.
Between cheese and meat is 1 hour, but between meat and
Aren't there
cheese...
those
no,
that...
there are lenient hour people.
There are people, yeah, Chabad.
Yeah, not Chabad.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, that's what you're saying,
The
Chabad.
most lenient
Yeah.
opinion is
No.
Do less.
1 hour.
1
Well,
hour.
There are...
There's an hour group.
accepted.
Yeah, there are those who wait an hour between meat and milk. Now, just 2 things to finish off with very briefly at least. One is the custom of half an hour. There are some who have a custom to wait half an hour in between milk and meat, and it's not clear where this custom comes from, because in Shulchan Aruch there's no requirement to wait at all, and the Zohar speaks about 1 hour, so where does the half an hour come from? So various suggestions have been put forward. One suggestion is that sometimes, especially in Aramaic, when you say an hour, it doesn't necessarily mean an hour. It means a significant amount of time, which is considered to be half an hour. Just for example,
Or a short one.
yeah, but there's sources brought to the concept of an hour, meaning of a time, a significant amount of time, meaning specifically half an hour. And the laws of melicha, of salting meat, and in other places. Just an example, which would be more, that obviously doesn't even mean half an hour. In the bracha that we say, Asher Yotzar, we say that if we thank Hashem for the way our body operates, and we say that if any of the holes in our bodies were to be closed, were to become blocked for afilu shor achas, then we wouldn't be able to survive. Now, obviously, there it doesn't mean if your holes are blocked for an hour, because if a person's bodily functions stop for less than an hour, he also wouldn't survive. So Shor Achas doesn't necessarily mean an hour, so that could be some basis. Another possibility is the concept of Rubai Kukuloi, that perhaps the majority of an hour is considered an hour, so therefore half an hour is 31 minutes, you're good to go. Anyway, be that as it may, there are those who has the custom of half an hour, the Chabad custom, and based on many authorities' understanding in the Zohar, is to wait a whole hour between milchiks and fleishiks. Now, just to finish off with one last point before we make a mezumin and bench, is the question was raised here about hard cheese. Now, maybe we'll talk about this more during the week, but between Mincha and Ma'ariv. But in short, and theoretically, one is for hard cheeses, one is supposed to treat like meat and wait 6 hours if that's your custom for meat. What exactly constitutes hard cheese is
Thank you. I got it wrong.
Thank
Nice
you.
meeting you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What exactly constitutes hard cheese is a bit of the discussion, which maybe we'll elaborate on later. Practically speaking, it's not very common to have hard cheese that is considered hard cheese. In other words, according to the majority of poskim, most of the cheeses, if not all of the cheeses that we have today, are not considered hard to require 6 hours. However, there are those, if you want to be machmir, it's definitely a good thing to be machmir. There are authorities that say you have to wait 6 hours for all hard cheeses, and there are authorities that say
Parmesan was hard cheese.
some people say Parmesan is already considered hard cheese, or the Swiss cheeses with the holes and all that stuff. Different opinions. To be elaborated on. I've used all my time. I personally didn't wash. Somebody who washed would make a mezumin, and
And then we'll have our meat here.
next week.
For
Bring
sure, what
over
you should
some
do is you
Siddur
wash
and Dan.
on the night meal, the first day.
Yeah.
The next day, you have milk.
No, but you have the chiyuv to have passed by day.
What?
The chiyuv to have passed by day.
I say you wash the first meal for fleishiks. The next day you wash for milk with milk. No problem. And you got 2 meals, 2 different days.
That's
a
what
long
we're
separation.
doing, right?
89.
I mean, lasagna during the day.
Smart woman.
Gotta test.
All right, who here watched?
I got, one second, I'll be.
So we got 3?